I was just going to mention I did prepare for this little section. I wrote down about 10 questions that I might have if I were somewhere between do I buy this thing or do I just plan to hire it out. So we're really hoping that you all have questions. All the questions I had, I heard them answered in the last couple of presentations for sure, or I saw some slides that he snuck past that would have covered information I was interested in. So, please, any questions that anybody has. If I could just ask one question before, who finds themselves in that area between do I buy or do I continue to hire out? Is anybody thinking about taking on, buying this equipment, training your staff, and doing this as an in-house thing? Nobody? One? All right.
Thank you. Dr. Brown?
We found out recently, I'm David Brown from Eastern Kentucky University, and I'm in the wildlife management program, but we run a natural resource crew of students, many of whom are here that we train, and we don't have any experience with drones, but EKU has an aviation program that has an unmanned piloting licensing process and training. And then we also have a Department of Agriculture that we recently found out has a couple of drones that are suitable for this kind of use. So we think we can use those. So we're kind of in that gray area where we think we are fortunate enough to have the equipment, but we don't have anybody yet in our small group with the training. But we think there's people at EKU we can work with to kind of get up to speed. And fortunately now we've been introduced to a lot of other people here that we feel comfortable reaching out to for additional information and guidance. So that's not really a question.
No, very cool. There are a lot of great people. I know at EKU, we've met several folks that have big ideas for both on the monitoring and the mitigation side. Does anybody else want to share?
I just want to mention that I have a lot of conversations with other agencies on the side, so I don't want to speak for them, but some of those conversations include we're trying to make a decision. Do we want to think about buying something ourselves, right? But maybe they're not at the point of, including like Department of Fish and Wildlife, Division of Forestry, for example. I think they're leaning on probably contracting more of it, but those discussions come up about maybe at some point down the road, there will be a place for us to also purchase something if they see the volume of need.
I don't think he's been introduced yet, but we do have Thomas here today. The Julian Farm folks earlier had shared their battle against the pears and all, and he did the applications on that. He pretty much does this every day, so if you wanted to speak directly to a contractor, we do have the guy here for you. So does anybody want to jump in with any questions that they have? My next presentation, we're going to be talking a little bit about the mapping that goes on the front end. So if you were trying to figure out a plan for spraying, we're going to show you how you can use mapping tech to kind of pre-map on the front end and then get a plan for how you actually want to apply your chemical after the fact.
So with your expense, you talked about insurance. I mean, that's a lot of expense right there. So hiring somebody professionally that already knows what they're doing, already has the equipment and can do it, just makes sense
Seems
to me.
to, yes, sir, I agree.
Hey, Josh. In your estimation, approximately here in Kentucky, how many independent spray operators are there, would you think?
And so I believe there are at least, so I mentioned there are 50 registered drones across the state. I think there are at least, in my estimation, if I had to guess, probably at least 200 across the state. And that I know, and there's just different, I've talked to different businesses, they talk about selling at least 50 or 60, and I know they're not the ones, like the ones who are registered are the ones who are the service providers. And so a lot of the farmers, I think, are not registered and just, they don't want to be on the radar. They're, maybe afraid of the regulations and whatnot. But I know there's probably at least, in my estimation, probably 200, if I had to guess. At least.
So you could buy a drone when that shows your
Yeah, and well, no, they're just concerned about the money aspect. So, but they are fairly intuitive. There is a slight learning curve, but a lot of times I think it is fairly intuitive to operate. So actually setting up, you maybe talk to the contractor that's here. Setting up your fields, do the work ahead of time. You do the work setting up your flight pans for your fields, set up boundary points. So you can set up boundary points for trees and give yourself a little bit of extra room on your fence lines, along fence lines with trees. And I think it can be a fairly effective. It can be a fairly effective product for a lot of these producers. And just the main reason I've talked to farmers, and the main reason they have is just flexibility. So they're trying to get somebody in there to do it when the chemical needs to be applied, and that's the main challenge they have with everybody else. And I think even our local southern states, and I think in Harrisburg, has gotten rid of their sprayer capacity. It was one of the casualties of COVID, and so I think a lot of theirs is now through a drone operator. And so I think we're seeing this across the state, and I'm worried about fertilizer buggies. Maybe in the future, are we going to still be able to get them from their insurance standpoint? And so that might be contracted out as well. And so that's something that the drone can do. Maybe have to get more drones to actually be effective. But there's a lot of hillsides, I think, maybe here and in Frankfort and Mercer County that I don't want to be on, but I still want to fertilize. And so a drone might be the best option for some of those hillside challenges, in my opinion.
One of the things that some of our clients are looking for is information about on a given parcel that we're coming in. So I'm doing herbicide applications on the ground. Kind of what percentage of the area has invasives, where are they kind of located, what's kind of a density, or some kind of data about what's out there. Then we come in and do our processes, and then they would like some information to communicate back. Okay, what's the before and what's the after, and communicating those results on, because they've got to communicate that to people who are setting the budgets to show, okay, there's a bit of it. So I'm speaking about something that's not in a agricultural context, more about like kind of natural areas or something like that. But could you all speak to anything about the onboard technology, either on the drone itself, that kind of would be able to show some information like that, or is that something kind of after the flight and something that's processed afterwards? And how is that generally communicated onto a client or the client?
You can go ahead, Josh.
Okay. Okay. So they do have maps where, like on your, when you set up your map, you can pretty much show, and what you spray, you can show, we sprayed this much chemical over this many acres. If you had any increases throughout there, you can actually develop a map. So there are ways you can export the as sprayed, because a lot of times they'll say this field is 80 acres, this field is 79 acres. So one of the things I know Caleb, he mentioned Caleb Cantor's done some of the contract spraying. One of the things he does is like, this is actually what we sprayed from a chemical standpoint. And then a lot of times what he's using is just de facto knowledge from his standpoint. Like, we've sprayed this before, we've seen it being very effective. And so that's what he generally says. You'll see this much burn down, or see this much complete coverage. And it's been improving, I think, with the evolution of the drones. So as we get to from the T40 to the T50, the T50 drone has been able to climb hills a little better, so it's a little more effective than I think its predecessor. And so we're seeing a gradual evolution and improvement in technology, and so a lot of these are easier to use, and it's a lot easier to transfer information. So you do get as applied maps from these drones.
I'll just add to what you were throwing in there. The next presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about pre-flying, and then you basically do like a classification analysis to kind of determine all the constituents in the field. And then, of course, you could do your spray and then fly another time after to try to say, which constituents are there and which have vanished. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Do you have something to add, Eric?
So just what Jeremy was talking about, you can actually use a multispectral drone to actually fly that initial area, if you will, and then using the office software, process that data and determine where you might have deficiencies in that, and then use your spraying drone to to hit those deficient areas, and then refly that with your multispectral or even just an RGB camera, and be able to determine if those areas were effectively treated or not. So,
To follow up what he said, there's actually ways with a certain software. So Pix4D allows you to do spot spraying. So in areas that you felt like weren't quite covered as well, you could identify. Right now it's visually. At some point it'll be AI, but you can use certain thresholds, identify the areas that weren't quite sprayed as well, and then do spot spraying. So you'd be a little more effective with your chemical usage the second time around, and just hit what needs to be hit as opposed to the entire field. So there are ways, or you could do it the first time around that way. So you could spot spray and save some on your chemical usage. No, it's the same drone. It's just you're using a different software. You use a software package like Pix4D. So you'd have two drones. Yes, so you would have two drones. One to fly, so like they mentioned, one to fly with a multispectral RGB camera, and then you'd feed that information through Pix4D to your sprayer drone. And that's fairly streamlined. That's what the Pix4D does for you.
On the application side of things, a lot of we have diverse application needs. Sometimes it may just be like site prepping a field where some of the vegetation is relatively uniform, but then in other cases, it may be like diverse shrubs and trees. So the tops of that there's a lack of uniformity to that. So like the efficiency and maybe the efficacy of like, like how do you strategize what kind of heights you can fly over? Because right now too, there's a lot of questions about can you spray over trees, and we don't know the regs either, like us who aren't applicators, about how high can a spray drone fly, and then how high can you fly above certain things, right? If maybe both of y'all could speak to that.
So, depending on like when we were at the Julian Farm, most of the Bradfords, they were 4 or 5 foot tall. So I usually spray 10 foot above. So I'm flying at 15 foot, but I run a T50. And if it comes to a taller tree, it actually climb up and go over. So, and like when I sprayed at Shaker Village, it looked like a bunny rabbit. At all time, it was always changing. It was up and down, up and down. But I've got it set to where it's about 10 foot to 15 foot above what we're spraying. And depending on like our spray width, the closer you get to, the tighter your spray width is.
Are there regs that you can't go a certain height above certain things, or you just can't spray at certain heights at all?
I think you're not supposed to take an over 55-pound drone above 200 feet. Is what it is. So I haven't run into anything yet even spraying over power lines and stuff, we're still under the legal limit.
And maybe whether this is part of your practice or not, do you have any thoughts on how effective spraying over trees would be if your target is things much lower than the tops of the trees?
Yeah, most time, like at Shaker Village, we use a surfactant and it makes the chemical heavier and it falls straight to the ground. With the rotor wars too helps push it straight to the ground. So we haven't had a problem with that yet either.
And I'll just mention, so before that, they had a T40. If you got to that hill, it would usually stop. Yep. So T40 would stop, and so that's one of the improvements. They've added extra sensors, extra radar, so that it would be able to. Another thing we could do is we fly with a RTK drone. So as they probably know down there, you fly with an RTK drone, really map it out, and then you can import that. If it's really hilly, if it's trees, and varied topography, we import that map into our drone and help it, really navigate more easily. So there's a fruit tree mode, which helps you climb some of those hills. So there's different types of modes. So a lot of times they had a one for the flat plains and one for if you're in that more hilly, challenging topography. So there are different modes for the drones that you can utilize.
I was going to ask Julian Farm and Shaker Village about the burn after you sprayed. You haven't done a burn afterwards. What type of to get rid of the Bradford pear? Yeah, can you answer that?
We've got a couple of folks who are a little bit more advanced in knowledge of establishing those native grasses, and it might be that we actually have to do a couple more applications before something like a burn. It all just sort of depends. We're sort of wading the waters right now, but we want to make sure that we get the fescue killed as well, and the dreaded Johnson grass as well. So we want to make sure that it's sort of a blank slate, right?
We may be calling you again, Thomas.
Yeah, yeah. So stay close.
Yeah, so we just our burn and sorry, we did our spraying in end of August. So our plan is to do a spring burn, then follow it up with, I guess, spot spraying or more spraying after that. So we had really good. It was very effective at getting like the sericea and the stuff down on the ground level, but it's not going to do anything for the seed bank or anything like that. So where we did it, it was in a previously planted pollinator habitat field. So, and that field was planted in 2011. So we've got hopefully enough of a good native seed bank built up that when we go through, we're not stuck with what we initially had, which was Johnson grass and everything else we didn't want. So, but yeah, it's follow up. So, and then, and again, this is not my idea. This is coming from what Fish and Wildlife is doing. And because I emailed John Hass, I was like, John, what are y'all doing? And so it's spray, burn, spray, and then we'll see how it goes from there.
Can you spot spray tall, mature calorie pears effectively with a drone?
If you have the right chemical, then yes. Like I say, you can put it on like a fruit tree mold and where it above it, and you can nail wherever you want to spray. Right. Yes.
Way
Sir.
up there.
Yeah, there is. I forgot what the chemical is that kills hardwoods. I forgot.
Trickleper?
It won't really kill hardwoods because we sprayed that also at Shaker Village, but it wouldn't. It would get the smaller stuff, but it wouldn't get a hardwood. That's more. You'd have to get into the chemical side and see exactly what to kill a hardwood, but there is stuff out there to kill hardwoods.
Any more questions? Joe, do you got another question back here? Yeah, we have a few minutes for a couple more questions. I know this was kind of a short discussion panel, but we take a few more questions.
Can you speak a little bit to, I think you'd mentioned hillsides, and some of our interest too is hillsides, things like autumn olive on hillsides, honeysuckle, places where it's too dangerous or you can't reach it with equipment, too dangerous for a person. That's some of our interest is application of, spray drones on some of these places it's hard for us to get to. If you haven't worked on like brush on hillsides, what do you think about it,
We've done some spraying for a guy in Versailles that lives on the river, and we got into a river bottom where we could see up the cliff, and we sprayed a bunch of invasive stuff there, and just everything but the hardwoods is what we killed off the cliffside on the river. And like I said, the T50, they had a 40 that come in. And the 40 really won't climb as steep as it is, but with the 50, we set it back to, I think it was 15 foot. And it just climbs, it follows the terrain just like it ought to on hillsides, or we try to run it sideways and up and down both, and it does phenomenal.
Is it really risky to manually fly something like a T30 or T40 on a hillside manually?
Yes, sir. They are. And they're pretty prone to, even with the new updates, they've been falling out of the sky too. So,
Literally just falling out of the sky.
Literally just falling out of the sky. We've got. I work with a guy in Wisconsin. Together we spray 70,000 acres a year, and we quit selling. I'm also a dealer for DJI, and we quit selling T40s because of that reason. They'll just be flying across corn, and then you got to go find your drone out of the corn.
Worst nightmare come true.
I think Do you have one more thing to say? Yeah.
Say one more thing. So he mentioned some of the dangers, but really, what's going to get you a lot of times? So I've heard like it's usually power lines or the little tree limbs, and that's what's going to take you down. And so that's it's your field edges, and so some people's like, oh, you need to get right close to the field edges. If you have trees on the next to your field edge, and that's not going to be your most productive ground. So don't really try to hug those tree lines. And if you get you have to decide, in your opinion, what's close enough and safe enough. And the other danger is going to be power lines. So a lot of times, if we we're trying to fly parallel to the power line if we can. And it depends on, I guess, the size of one. If you get the really big ones or the small ones. Sometimes you can fly under some of those big ones, and the smaller ones maybe I'll go up and over. It just depends on the site and how you evaluate your risk. And so, a lot of times for the guys who ever crash, and you will crash at some point, and it's got collision avoidance sensors, not collision 100% prevent accidents sensors. So, but the T50 is definitely a marked improvement. Just because instead of having one radar, it has two radars. It has more molecular vision sensors that are positioned correctly. And so the T40 could not climb hills, whereas this one, and the T30, in my mind, is just obsolete at this point. And so there are certain ones, and if we're, another thing I will say, if we're too far from the site, if we're going to be, a lot of times we're flying directly adjacent to our field, taking off and landing. But if that's not possible, I'm thinking about a T25 because it has a little more battery life. I can use that T50 battery, and I can get more battery life. And I'm not spraying. I won't hold as much chemical, but I can get, if my waypoint where I have to take off is going to be a lot farther than where I have to actually spray. That can be good for those fields that are far away, maybe really irregular shaped, or I can't take off directly adjacent or within that field. I think.
The T25 also uses the new radar as a T50, so you have that also.
So it depends on what I'm doing. If I'm flying, most of the time we're flying right next to our field, but if that's not possible, if I want some range, I think about the T25.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap up our discussion for the sake of time. But thank you guys so much for being up here. And I think everyone's going to be around for a little bit of the day. So if you have any more questions, feel free to find these guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you.